In the year 1863, the United States was in the middle of a war that was already unlike any conflict the nation had ever experienced. 2 years earlier, in 1861, the country had fractured. 11 southern states had declared secession and formed a new government known as the Confederate States of America. The federal government in Washington rejected the legality of that decision. The result was the American Civil War. By the beginning of 1863, hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already been killed or wounded. Entire regions of the country had been devastated. Cities were under military occupation. Railroads and farms had become battlefields. And yet, despite the scale of the conflict, one central issue still remained politically unresolved. Was this war being fought only to preserve the Union, or was it also a war about slavery? The answer would transform the meaning of the war itself, and that transformation would come through one of the most significant political decisions in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. The war's original purpose. When the Civil War began in 1861, the official objective of the United States government was not the abolition of slavery. It was the preservation of the Union. President Abraham Lincoln had made this position clear. Lincoln personally believed slavery was morally wrong, but as president, he faced complex political constraints. Several slave-holding states had remained loyal to the Union. These states, often called the border states, included Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. If the federal government moved immediately to abolish slavery everywhere, leaders feared these states might also join the Confederacy. That possibility could dramatically strengthen the Southern war effort. As a result, during the early years of the war, the Union government framed the conflict primarily as a struggle to preserve the United States. This distinction mattered. Many Northern soldiers did not initially believe they were fighting to end slavery. They believed they were fighting to keep the country intact. But the realities of war were already beginning to change that perspective. Slavery and the war effort. Even before 1863, slavery had become deeply entangled with military strategy. Enslaved labor supported the Confederate war effort. Enslaved people worked on plantations producing food and cotton. They built fortifications. They transported supplies. In many places, enslaved people were essential to maintaining the Southern economy during wartime. As Union armies advanced into Southern territory, enslaved people began escaping to Union lines. Thousands fled plantations and sought protection from Union troops. These individuals became known in military language as contrabands of war. Union commanders faced an immediate dilemma. Under existing law, enslaved people were still legally considered property in the states where slavery was recognized. Returning them to enslavers would support the Confederate economy. Allowing them to remain with Union forces could weaken the South. Gradually, Union policy shifted. Many escaped enslaved people were allowed to stay near Union camps. Some began working for the Union Army as laborers, cooks, or guides. The war was already beginning to disrupt the institution of slavery, long before any formal proclamation. Political pressure in the North. As the war continued, pressure grew on the Lincoln administration to take stronger action against slavery. Abolitionists argued that slavery was the root cause of the conflict. They believed the Union could not truly win the war while slavery continued to exist. Prominent activists, writers, and politicians urged the president to act. Among them was Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved man who had become one of the most powerful voices against slavery in the United States. Douglass argued that transforming the war into a struggle for emancipation would strengthen the Union cause morally and politically. Others disagreed. Some Northern citizens feared that ending slavery would bring social and economic upheaval. Political leaders worried that radical changes could divide Northern voters and weaken support for the war. Lincoln had to navigate these competing pressures while also directing a massive military conflict. A president's calculation. By 1862, Lincoln began to consider a new possibility. If the federal government declared enslaved people in Confederate territories to be free, it could weaken the Southern war effort. It could also redefine the purpose of the war. Such a decision would carry enormous consequences. It would transform the conflict from a war to preserve a political union into a war that also challenged slavery itself. But Lincoln did not act immediately. He waited for a strategic moment. The Union Army had suffered several difficult defeats early in the war. Announcing emancipation during the period of military weakness might appear desperate. Lincoln believed the policy needed to be introduced from a position of strength. That moment came after a major battle in September 1862. The battle took place near a small town in Maryland. Its name was the Battle of Antietam. Although the battle itself was tactically inconclusive, Union forces had halted a Confederate invasion of the North. Lincoln used this moment to make a historic announcement. The Preliminary Proclamation. In September 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation. The announcement was conditional. It declared that if the Confederate States did not end their rebellion by January 1, 1863, enslaved people within those territories would be declared free. The Confederacy did not comply, and on January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. What the proclamation actually did. The Emancipation Proclamation is often misunderstood. It did not immediately free every enslaved person in the United States. Its legal authority applied only to areas that were in rebellion against the federal government. Enslaved people in loyal border states were not immediately freed, nor were those in southern areas already under Union control. This limitation was not accidental. Lincoln justified the proclamation as a military measure during wartime. By targeting Confederate territory, the order was framed as a strategy to weaken the enemy. Even with these limitations, the proclamation had enormous impact. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate territories shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. It also authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. This decision would change the course of the war. A transformation of purpose. The Emancipation Proclamation did not immediately end slavery, but it transformed the meaning of the Civil War. The Union was no longer fighting only to restore the nation. It was now also fighting a war that directly challenged slavery itself. This shift had international consequences. European powers such as Britain and France had economic ties to Southern cotton. Some political leaders in Europe considered recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. But once the war became associated with the fight against slavery, supporting the Confederacy became politically difficult for governments in countries where slavery had already been abolished. The proclamation therefore strengthened the Union's diplomatic position abroad. The war changes. Perhaps the most immediate military impact of the Emancipation Proclamation came from a new source of soldiers, Black Americans. Following the proclamation, African American men were officially allowed to enlist in the Union Army. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers would serve in the Union military. Their participation played a critical role in the final years of the conflict. The Civil War was no longer only a struggle between two armies. It had become a struggle over the future of freedom in the United States. A decision that reshaped a nation. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end the war. It did not immediately abolish slavery across the country, but it changed the direction of the conflict.
It linked the survival of the Union with the destruction of slavery, and it set the stage for a permanent constitutional change that would come later. In 1865, the United States would adopt the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That amendment abolished slavery throughout the nation, but the political and moral turning point that made that amendment possible began in 1863 with a wartime proclamation that redefined the purpose of the Civil War.
By the beginning of 1863, the American Civil War had already consumed enormous resources and lives. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands were fighting across a vast landscape. Cities had been occupied, railroads destroyed, families divided. Yet even after 2 years of conflict, neither side had secured decisive victory. The war had begun as a struggle over the survival of the United States, but the Emancipation Proclamation began to transform it into something larger. The proclamation did not simply declare freedom for enslaved people in Confederate territory. It also opened the door to a new and powerful development. African American men could now serve as soldiers in the Union military. This decision would reshape the character of the war, from escaped slaves to Union soldiers. Long before African Americans were officially allowed to enlist, many had already contributed to the Union war effort. As Union armies moved through Southern territory, enslaved people often fled plantations and sought protection near Union camps. Some worked as laborers, others served as guides or scouts. Their knowledge of local terrain and Southern infrastructure sometimes proved invaluable to Union commanders. Still, their legal status remained uncertain. Before 1863, the federal government had not formally authorized large-scale black enlistment. There were exceptions in certain locations, particularly in coastal areas where Union control was strong, but nationwide policy remained cautious. Many political leaders worried that arming black soldiers might provoke backlash among white voters in the North or the border states. The Emancipation Proclamation changed that. It explicitly authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. For the first time in American history, large numbers of African American men would serve as uniformed combat troops in a national military force. A new force in the Union Army. After the proclamation took effect on January 1, 1863, recruitment of African American soldiers began in earnest. The Union created segregated units specifically organized for black troops. These units were placed under the authority of the United States Colored Troops. Most officers in these units were white, though black non-commissioned officers also played leadership roles. Despite segregation and discrimination, thousands of African American men volunteered to serve. Some had escaped from slavery. Others had been free before the war began. For many, enlistment was about more than military duty. It was about freedom. Serving in the Union Army offered a chance not only to fight for the country, but also to help destroy the institution that had enslaved millions. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black soldiers would serve in the Union military. Another 20,000 would serve in the Union Navy. Together, they represented roughly 10% of Union military forces by the war's final years. The risks they faced. Service in the Union Army was dangerous for any soldier, but for African American troops, the risks were even greater. The Confederate government refused to recognize black Union soldiers as legitimate combatants. Instead, Confederate authorities often treated black Union soldiers as escaped slaves or rebels. In some cases, black soldiers captured in battle were executed. Others were forced into slavery or hard labor. White officers commanding black troops also faced severe punishment if captured. The Confederate position reflected a refusal to accept the legitimacy of black men serving as armed soldiers. For African American troops, the war was therefore not only about military victory, it was about survival and recognition as human beings with rights. Pay and discrimination. African American soldiers also faced discrimination within the Union Army itself. Initially, they were paid less than white soldiers, Black soldiers received $10 per month, while white soldiers earned $13 per month plus additional allowances. This pay gap caused widespread anger among black troops. Some units protested by refusing pay entirely until equality was granted. Eventually, in 1864, the federal government corrected the disparity and granted equal pay to black soldiers retroactively. The struggle over pay illustrated an important truth about the Civil War. Even within the Union Army, an army fighting a rebellion connected to slavery, racial inequality still existed. The war was reshaping the nation, but that transformation was incomplete and contested. Proving their ability. Many white Americans initially doubted whether African American soldiers could perform effectively in combat. These doubts were rooted in racist assumptions common in the 19th century, but battlefield experience began to challenge those beliefs. One of the most famous examples came in July 1863. A regiment of African American soldiers launched a courageous assault against a Confederate fortification near Charleston, South Carolina. This unit was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. The attack took place at Second Battle of Fort Wagner. The assault was extremely dangerous. Union forces had to advance across open sand toward heavily defended Confederate positions. Casualties were severe. The regiment suffered heavy losses, including the death of its commander, Robert Gould Shaw. Although the attack did not capture the fort, the bravery displayed by the soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts received national attention. Their actions helped demonstrate that African American soldiers could fight with discipline and courage equal to any other troops. Stories of their bravery spread through newspapers across the North. Public perception slowly began to change. A strategic advantage. The participation of black soldiers also had important strategic consequences for the Union war effort. The Union faced enormous demands for manpower. Armies needed soldiers not only to fight battles, but also to guard railroads, protect supply lines, and occupy captured territory. African American troops helped fill these roles. Their presence allowed more white soldiers to move to front-line combat positions. In addition, many black soldiers possessed valuable knowledge about Southern geography and infrastructure. Formerly enslaved men who had worked on plantations understood local roads, rivers, and supply networks. This knowledge could provide useful intelligence for Union commanders. The enlistment of black troops therefore strengthened the Union militarily while weakening the Confederate system that relied on enslaved labor. A war about freedom. The presence of black soldiers on the battlefield also transformed the moral meaning of the conflict. African American troops were not only fighting for the Union, they were fighting for their own freedom. Their participation symbolized the broader transformation of the conflict. What had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union was now increasingly becoming a war that challenged slavery itself. This shift did not happen instantly. Many white soldiers in the Union Army still held racist views. Some resented the presence of black troops. Others doubted whether the war should focus on emancipation, but the reality of African American service gradually reshaped attitudes. Shared hardship in military camps and on battlefields created experiences that were difficult to ignore. The war was forcing Americans to confront questions about citizenship, equality, and freedom. International impact. The transformation of the war also influenced how foreign governments viewed the conflict. European powers had watched the Civil War closely. Countries such as Britain and France had economic ties to Southern cotton. Some political leaders in Europe considered recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation, but the Emancipation Proclamation complicated that possibility. Once the Union government linked the war to the destruction of slavery, European public opinion shifted. Many European citizens opposed slavery. Recognizing the Confederacy would now appear as support for a slave-holding state. The participation of black soldiers reinforced this perception. The Union could now present itself internationally as a nation fighting not only to preserve itself, but also to end slavery. This diplomatic shift helped discourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy. The human dimension.
For the men who enlisted in the United States colored troops, the war was deeply personal. Many had lived their entire lives under slavery. Joining the Union Army represented a dramatic transformation. They were no longer simply subjects of oppression. They were now armed participants in shaping the nation's future. Military service offered opportunities for education, leadership, and community organization. Black churches and local leaders often supported recruitment efforts. Families saw enlistment as a pathway towards securing freedom and dignity. Yet the risks remained enormous. African American soldiers faced the same dangers of combat as any other troops, and if captured, they often faced even harsher treatment. Despite those dangers, tens of thousands chose to serve. Their decision would help shape the outcome of the war. A turning point. By the middle of the Civil War, the participation of black soldiers had become an undeniable part of the Union war effort. Their service strengthened Union armies, it weakened the Confederate labor system, and it transformed the meaning of the conflict. The war that had begun as a struggle for national unity was now clearly connected to the future of slavery in America. This transformation did not happen instantly. Many white soldiers in the Union Army still held racist views. Some resented the presence of black troops. Others doubted whether the war should focus on emancipation. But the reality of African